So what do you think, Saito-san? About what Hijikata-san said earlier, I mean.
Peek!
どうとは
Well, if things go the way Hijikata-san predicted them to, then we might end up losing this time around, right?
そうだろうな。我々の持つ武器はあくまでも旧式のもの。新型の兵器を駆使する薩長の部隊には到底歯が立たん。しかも今回共に戦う新入りの大使たちはどれも銃などまともに扱えぬ輩ばかりだ。
Yeah, that's not a good thing you want your recruits to be doing. To go after alcohol than, you know, a gun or a sword like you really need them to be. Then why don't they find swordsmen?
人を殺めたことがある者が何の咎めもなしに市中を往来していると思うか。道場剣術がどれほどうまくとも実戦では何の役にも立たん。戦いにおいて寛容なのは人を切ることができるかどうかだ。
Saito-san was right. It didn't matter how many men we recruited. Without actual experience on the battlefield, we may as well have been sending men to their graves. Having both Hijikata-san and Saito-san describe in great detail just how dire our situation was awoke within me a potent, depressive hopelessness. Aren't you scared, Saito-san? Entering the battlefield knowing that defeat could be likely? You might die. In my heart, I realized how futile this question might have sounded, especially to someone like Saito-san, who on numerous occasions came face to face with death. He was the man who, without a shred of doubt, accepted death as his companion a long time ago. It was a bravery that I could not fathom.
死ぬこと自体は怖くはない。
His answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, was delivered indifferently. But he added something that I was not expecting.
ただ、信じているものを見失うのは恐ろしい。
What you believe in? His words were so obscure that it was difficult for me to extract any kind of meaning from them. After a calm pause, Saito-san looked me in the eye, taking a deep breath before asking me a question.
武士の別の呼び名を知っているか。
Other name? You mean like samurai? Saito-san shut his eyes and slowly shook his head.
左差し。武士が刀を刺すのは左の腰だからな。刀を刺した侍はどんな狭い道でも左端を歩く。武士の魂たる刀を他人に触れさせたくはないからな。
Huh? But you're... Saito-san kept his sword on the right side of his hips, and he always unsheathed with his left. After giving it a second of consideration, I don't think I've seen anyone other than Saito-san who kept their sword on the right side.
俺は生まれつき左利きだ。そのせいでどの道場に行っても免状や切り紙など受け取ったことはない。竹刀を握った瞬間、まず部長訪問と持ち方を正される。その繰り返しだった。だがそんなことを言った連中で俺に勝った者はただの一人もいない。師範代、目録、大層な肩書きを持った者でも打ち合えば無名の俺に負ける。 本物の強さとは一体何だ。昔の俺はそんなことばかり考えていた。
Saito-san muttered to himself nonchalantly. However, learning how much he had overcome told me just how much this question meant to him. For years? So, does that mean you found an answer? Saito-san fell silent. Without another word, he unsheathed his sword, and the cold, shimmering moonlight reflected off of the blade.
簡単なことだ。真剣で切り合って勝った方が強い。単純にして明快な答えだ。260年続いた太平の世で侍同士が切り合いをすることなどめったになくなってしまったが、それでも侍というのは刀を振るうのが本分だったはずだ。俺はそう考えていた。
Saito-san's eyes glowed from the shine of the lit blade, but they still carried a thick darkness behind them. A tingling chill ran down the length of my spine.
だが、そう思っていたのは俺だけだったようだ。新選組ができる前、ある旗本の指定に果たし合いを申し込まれ、その相手を切り殺したことがある。
What? A Hanamoto was one of the elites in our society. To kill one of them in a duel, I imagine, would have been a serious offense.
俺が果たし合いに勝ち、その相手は負けた。だが勝ったはずの俺は罪に問われ、史跡を剥奪されて武士の証を失った。武士というのはもともと人を切るのが役目だったはずなのに、実際に切ると罪人と呼ばれる。こんな矛盾した話があるか。その頃の俺はそう考えていた。
The weight that Saito-san put behind each utterance of warrior was so heavy, as though his life was formed and guided by those standards alone. I doubt, sadly, that I would be able to find many who would find themselves in agreement with him. Despite having an unparalleled talent, he had no one to validate said talent, a frustrating fact indeed. His tragic lack of support instigated him to relay his own measures for both strength and honor for validation, which were tricky to navigate. For once I yawned. For once I caught a glimpse of the bitter loneliness that had been nursing for most. For once I caught a glimpse of the bitter loneliness that he had been nursing for most of his life.
だが新選組の皆は勝つために、目の前の相手を殺して己が生き残るために刀を振る。それは俺の思い描く武士の姿とよく似ていた。司令官で皆に会った時は初めて話の通じる相手に巡り合ったと思ったものだ。
Hearing Saito-san's story made me finally realize all that gave him strength and brought him strife. The Shinsengumi was the shelter and system of support that he had needed.
新選組で一番人を切っているのはおそらく俺か宗司のどちらかだろう。だがどれだけ多くの人間を切り殺しても薄気味悪がられ恨まれこそすれ感謝されることなど絶対にない。俺が今まで研ぎ続けてきた爪はシャバでは何の役にも立たない。それは自分でもよく分かっている。
Saito-san rotated the blade to make his reflection visible, and he gazed longingly at himself. Taking a closer look at his sword, I realized that it was quite thinner than some of what the other men had. I suppose he sharpened his blade religiously, wearing it out in combat until it was of no use at all. If what he had said about his amount of kills were true, then it must have happened dozens of times.
だがこれがこの爪だけが俺が勝ち続けてきた証なのだ。切り合いでは誰にも負けぬはずの血生臭い剣技だけが。
I gasped. When Saito-san drank the water of life, he said it was in order to protect me, but perhaps more than that, he was afraid of confronting what defeat might mean to himself, which served in the greater interest of preserving his pride. So this is what gave Saito-san the will to continue.
しかし時代は変わった。鍛え抜かれた剣の技よりも妖獣の方が多くの人間を殺すことができる。武士が刀を持つ意味も俺が爪を研ぎ続ける意味もなくなりつつある。
Saito-san bitterly bit into his lips, sheathing his sword back into its scabbard. For him, wielding the sword was the single most important honor any man could have. But the age of the blade was coming to its end. Beyond facing death or accepting the burden of becoming a fury, Saito-san's very way of life was threatened by the passage of time, an inevitable deluge of change beyond himself. This would make anyone nervous, but to Saito-san, it meant a total reevaluation to the truths he had held dear for the eternity of his life. What could I possibly say to him? Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. Maybe a time will come when warriors are no longer needed in our world. Even Hichikata-san admitted that the sheer range and power of a rifle puts us at a huge disadvantage against the Sacho. They were too advanced. My response seemed to sting Saito-san, and he glared angrily towards the empty space beside us. But even if a time comes when samurai and katanas are no longer needed, that doesn't mean that you won't be needed too, Saito-san.
どういうことだ?
His sour tone made me flinch a little, but I took a deep breath to articulate my position calmly. Like you said, swords are for killing. Blood has been spilled on your hands, and certainly on your sword. But I disagree. Your sword also has the power to save lives. I, for one, am one of those who count themselves as lucky enough to have been saved by you. During the Battle of Toba-Fushimi, and from my father back in Edo. If you hadn't been there, I would have been killed. At the end of the day, my word came from someone who lived a relatively sheltered life of privilege. I was under constant protection. All the same, I hope my words would do something to motivate and inspire Saito-san to retain his pride. Which is why I'm so very thankful for you, Saito-san. I appreciate you. No matter what happens in the world, even if it decides that it no longer needs the samurai, I will always need you. You saved my life. Saito-san's lip curled inquisitively, making it difficult for me to read how he was feeling. Once more, he turned away from me, staring into the darkness in contemplation. Maybe what I said was out of line. just as my anxiety began to flare. Saito-san stroked his soft, slender fingers against the side of my cheek. I could see the gorgeous dazzle of stars in his dark, mysterious eyes, which were stoically fixed on my own. Is something wrong, Saito-san? This gesture startled me initially, and I nervously asked him why, but he remained silent, offering no answer with his words as much as his body language. His eyes scanned me thoroughly. As if he were searching for something conspicuous, but when... Finally, he spoke breathily.
誠実な目をしているな。嘘や偽りではない。魂からの言葉を口にした時の瞳だ。初めて司令官に行き、門人たちと打ち合った時、試合に立ち会った皆が俺を強いと評した。今のお前と同じ目で。だからこそ思った。ここでなら俺の剣の使い道を見つけられるのではないかと。
His voice was as quiet as always. However, I sensed a small sense of relief in him, and he was less tense than when I had found him. Seeing him relax made my heart feel warm. So, let's keep our faith in the Shinsengumi then. They're the ones who recognized your strength before anyone else did. A strength that even you yourself were unaware of. Even if one day... Even if one day you no longer needed your sword, then I am sure that none of them would even think of abandoning you. Saito-san's eyes shot wide open in surprise. His mouth timidly formed into a slight curl, and he attempted an awkward but adorable smile.
ただ美中を尽くすのみか。
What? I wasn't sure what Saito-san was murmuring.
雪村、感謝する。今まで見えなかった何かがおぼろげにだが見えてきた。
Gratitude sounded strange coming from him, but there was no question that it was genuine. His hands lingered on my face a moment longer, and then I slowly drew them back.
この時世、幕命を受けたとて命を懸けて戦おうとする武士は多くない。
It was true. After all, the Supreme Commander himself had abandoned his troops at the first sign of trouble. And moreover, even the Hideyoshi Daimyo and the Tokugawa affiliate Daimyo turned their backs on the shogunate.
だが鳥羽伏見の戦で新八は死ぬことを覚悟して切り込み隊に志願した。近藤さんは肩の傷が治ってすぐ戦線に復帰した。土方さんは敗北して大使の非難を受けることを覚悟で幕府のために戦おうとしている。近藤さんや土方さんはもともと武家の生まれではない。だが彼らの魂は誰よりも武士だ。武士というのは生き様を言うのだろう。
His voice was unfretted by the monotone that usually characterized it so often in the past. I couldn't say for sure, but It seemed as though just as Sato-san had hoped to convince me of his strength and reliability, he had also hoped to convince himself. For as long as I'd known him, I'd seen Saito-san as serious and single-minded, the sort of man who was steadfast in his convictions and his self-determined purpose. But now, it seemed, I was beginning to see the side of him that was, for lack of a better word, human.
そろそろ夜が明けるな。陣に戻るか。
You're right. The insects chirped and hummed from the trees as we made our way back to camp. We were nearly there when... And we have reached round 2. Sato-san stopped suddenly, and his face twisted with pain. Saito-san, what's wrong? I ran to him as he leaned heavily against a nearby tree, his fingers digging into the bark. His teeth ground aggressively, and his breath was strangled. As I watched, he began to sweat. My stomach pitched as I realized what it was. Is it blood? Do you want blood? And say it with me now. Give him blood. Saito-san, please, drink my blood.
必要ない。このままやり過ごせば収まる。
However, Sato-san's face warped in pain, and his forehead was covered in thick beads of sweat. That made it even more clear that he was craving blood. Please, I'll be fine. There was no point in arguing. I unsheathed my sword, and I slid the cold edge against my finger, feeling a burn as the flesh split open.
その小太刀を貸せ。
No, if you don't, you'll... I was sure he simply meant to take the sword away from me.
傷ならば俺がつける。貸せ。
That wasn't what I'd expected to hear. He took hold of my kodachi and stepped closer. I could hear his breath rattling in his chest. The blade pressed against my ear. He must have wanted to cut where it would barely be visible. I felt a spark of pain as it broke the skin, and then his face moved so close to mine. I could feel his breath on my ear. His lips pressed against my skin. I shivered as his breath touched my ears. Saito-san stopped and pulled away.
痛むか。
His voice was barely above a whisper, but it sounded loud in my ear. I'm fine. It just tickled a little bit. He seemed relieved to hear that, and I felt his tongue touch my ear once again. He was sipping the blood that was dripping from my ear. As he drank, Saito-san's breathing eased, and his shaking began to subside. After some time, he slowly stepped back.
すまなかったな。
His face was still pale, but at least the color was beginning to return. Don't worry about it. This will heal up in no time.
守るべき相手の血をすするなど本末転倒だな。
He gave a short bark of laughter. No, it's not like that. I mean, if you think about it, it's my fault you became a fury in the first place.
そうではない。俺が風間を殺せるほど強ければこうはならなかった。
He stood there silently for a moment, his back to me.
戻るぞ。 そろそろ皆が起き出してくる頃だ。
I nodded back to Saito-san and we returned to our camp.